If Makas Choshech represented the loss of power to the Mitzrayim, what was Makas Bechoros? Much greater. By the time Mitzrayim was subject to Makas Choshech, they already knew it was over. Because Makas Choshech basically said to Mitzrayim, you have no more power. The last vestige of the Shefa that they had was gone, basically, with Makas Choshech. Because once they lost the koyach of the sun, once they saw that their own sun god, who was their own shefa, turned against them, so to speak, they realized that they were impoverished from their koyach. They were no longer the Mitzrayim, nor would they ever again be Mitzrayim, just as they were before. What was Makas Bechoros? Let's investigate this. Let's understand this. Why was it the greatest and most powerful of all the Makas of Mitzrayim? And how does Makas Bechoros fit into the scheme and to the basic idea in which we interpret the Makas in general? Not so much as a mechanism, as an instrument of conflict to force Egypt to let the Jews go, but rather as a revelation of a loss of power, of a shefa which they once possessed b'kilkuloi, and which is now b'tikunoi, and that's why they no longer have it. First of all, let's look at Makas Bechoros. What actually happened to Makas Bechoros? Every Bechor of Mitzrayim died. Now, what was that really? It's a mass death. It's many, many people dying at the same time. Normally, if we analyze the characteristics of a mass death, we say, when a whole bunch of people die at the same time, how does that work? How is that possible? Well, they all have to be in some way in the same place at the same time. There's got to be a physical proximity in some way. For example, if you have a bunch of people who are walking over a bridge and the bridge suddenly falls, all the people die. Or if all the people are on a certain location and a disease breaks out, a plague, it kills most of them. So in other words, people have to have some kind of aspect of physical proximity, environmentally, in some way, to experience a mass death, meaning a death at the same time, in the same place, simultaneously. What was the mass death of Mitzrayim by the Bechor? Every Bechor died. But interestingly enough, what was the proximity of all the Bechor? They weren't all near each other. They lived all throughout Mitzrayim. This is number one. So the interesting question is, how has every Bechor died? What kind of death is this? In what did they all share? So that they all died at the same time. They were in different places, all of them. In order to understand this, we have to understand something called the Bechor factor. What exactly is the Bechor factor? What is a Bechor? Basically, any mishpacha, the peter rechem of a woman, the Bechor, if it's a boy, he basically is the main koyach of vuchnis in that mishpacha, in that family. When the Baruch Hashem wants to bring the tikkun to the bria, and therefore he gives the koyach of tikkun, or koyach of vuchnis to the bria, he mostly gives it to the Bechor. The Bechor of a family constitutes the main member of that family who has this basic job to being what? To be masaken, the ruchnius of the world itself. He is the main agent or sholiach for the tikkun of ruchnius. Therefore, he is given the greatest koyach of ruchnius in the family itself. That's why the Bechor is very different in many halachas in terms of nachlas, inheritance, and so on and so forth. Well, basically, that's what a Bechor is. The Bechor is the person who's neutel the ikar chelik of ruchnius, and therefore he's the ikar shaliach of that tikkun. Now, that's called the Bechor factor. Anyone who's a Bechor has this koyach. Now, where does this factor exist? If you look at a person, can you see he's a Bechor? No. The inyan of a Bechor, fundamentally, is an inyan of vuchnius. So therefore, the Bechor factor is a nefesh tikasimin. It's something which exists in the nefesh of that person. You cannot see it visibly on the person's face and so on, but rather exists in certain koyachas ha-nefesh that he has. What happened with Mitzrayim when all the Bechor died, meaning that there was a plague. It was mamash a plague. But it wasn't a regular deva, it was a deva of nefesh. In other words, just like certain diseases are attracted or have affinity for certain types of physical compositions and makeups, and they destroy certain people, you see, in that kind of way, the same thing here. What Moshe brought on Mitzrayim through the Yad Hashem was Makas Bechoros. He brought fundamentally a plague. It was a plague, but it was a different plague than what had ever been seen on the world before. It wasn't a physical plague, What it was is it was a destructive agent that had the ability to search out every individual who had that Bechor factor and kill him and take away the nefesh. Makas Bechoris was basically a mass death, but it was a mass death where it was death by nefesh, not by guf. The Bechors of Mitzrayim died by virtue of what they were in their neshamas, in their nefashos, by their spiritual koiches, not what they were in their guf. And it was irrelevant where they were physically in time and space, what their physical condition was. What was relevant to Makas Bechoris was who was he in terms of ruchnius. Was he a Bechor or not? Since the Bechor is distinguished by his ruchnistic koyach, you see, this koyach of ruchni that went out in the Bria, the Malach HaMovis, therefore identified every individual Mitzrayim who had the Bechor factor, and it was death by neshama. This was an incredible zach. Such a thing had never been done before. That an ummah, or that people should die by virtue of a common characteristic which exists in their nefesh, in their neshama, other than characteristics which exist in their guf or physical locations, and so on. Such a thing was a staggering thing, and it had never really occurred before. But this is fundamentally what Moshe had done. This is what Yidden had done. This is what the Bnei Hashem had done for Klal Yisrael. He killed all the Mitzrayim by virtue of the discriminating certain koiches in the neshama of the Egyptians, in the nefesh of every Egyptian. And that basic factor, which was the affinity factor for the Malach HaMavos, was the Bechor factor. The question comes, where did Moshe get this koyach? Where did Klal Yisrael get this koyach? That the Bnei Hashem should do such a thing for them. Where? Where was it obtained? Now, again, we have to analyze it according to the way we've been analyzing it before. Up to now we said that the koyach of every makkah, the koyach of Moshe, through the Yad Hashem, to bring every makkah Mitzrayim, came from the very shefa that was once controlled by Mitzrayim itself. By the kedusha that they once had, b'kulkuloi, Moshe and Klal Yisrael had b'tikunoi, and Moshe and Klal Yisrael were able to use this koyach. The Bnei Hashem allowed them to use this koyach. Moshe used this koyach and bring the shefa to be a what? To be a ma'anish of Mitzrayim, to punish Mitzrayim. So the question is, where did the koyach, this koyach, come from Mitzrayim, and where did Moshe Rabbeinu get this koyach to be able to do such a thing? It's critical to point out, just in retrospect, a Bechor is very similar to a Kohen, to a priest. It was the Bechoris, the Bechorim in ancient times that fundamentally were like the priests, and this is consistent from what we've said, that they were the ones who had the Koyach of Ruchnius and who were the agents of that Ruchnius. But basically, the ministry of Ruchnius was in the hands of the Bechorim. But again, this was a nefesh factor, and they were destroyed by this nefesh factor. Where did Moshe get this koyach to be able to destroy them? What kind of kedusha did Moshe get that was able to destroy this type of a person? Another case where you see the concept of Bechor is the concept of Yaakov and Esav. Esav was the Bechor, so therefore Esav really had the Ika koyach of Ruchnius as such. That's why Yaakov had to buy it from him. Why would Yaakov have to buy the Bechor from Esav if he himself was such a tzaddik? Because it wasn't so simple. There was a certain aspect of a Bechor factor which Yaakov lacked, and that thing would have to come from Esav. That's why he saw fit to buy it from Esav. But from this we see the concept of a Bechor, that a Bechor is an agent of a ruchnistic koyach, a special koyach itself. And this was the Bechor factor, which was the critical feature which was used in destroying the Bechor of Egypt. That's how the Malach HaMavos knew every Bechor, by his specific neshama. In order to understand the koyach behind Makas Bechoris, we have to understand the concept of Bechor itself. But not Bechor itself as it relates to each particular mishpacha, but as it relates to the Bria itself. Who was the first Bechor in the Bria? Adam Rishon. Adam Rishon was the Peter Rechem of the Bnei Shalom, so to speak. He was the firstborn of God. Therefore, it was Adam Rishon who had the tachlis of what? Of a Bechor. He had the tachlis of a Bechor, which was what? To be Masak in the Bria, and to bring the world to a Madreg of Olam Haba. That's the two tachlis of Bechor. But not only did he have the tachlis of a Bechor, he also had the koyach of a Bechor. He had the ability to bring that tikkun, because a special ruchnistic koyach that he possessed by virtue of his neshama. When Adam Rishon did the chet and he failed to do it, what did he do? He was mashchis, this Bechor. He put the Bechor, his neshama, this Bechor factor, into a state of kilkul or ashchasa. So what the Banisham did was, the Banisham took away this concept of Bechor from Adam Rishon and gave it to his Zerah, to his Toldus. Who did he give it to? All the Umas Olam, who were all the fragments of that neshama. So the concept of Bechor in a cosmic sense, not in an individualistic sense, in the cosmic sense, was given to all of mankind. All of mankind now were the Bechor of the Bria. They were the ones who had to be Masakin, the Ika Tikkunim, as such, of Olam Haba. But of course, in each particular mishpacha, there was specific Bechor in each of the mishpachas. But from a cosmic sense, from a world view, the Bechor of the Bria was taken from Adam and given to his Toldus. They basically had his tachlis itself. When the Umas Olam were mashchus, their chelik in Olam Haba, and therefore was taken away from them to a large extent, they lost the Bechor. And what the Banishim did was, he went over to Avram and he said, I'm going to give you the koyach of the Bechor. You will be the Bechor of the Bria. It is your tachlis now to see to it that the Bria comes to a state of tikkun and Olam Haba. That's number one. Number two, I'm going to give you a certain koyach to be able to do that. But fundamentally, what you're going to have to do is to be matar the chelik which was destroyed by everyone else. In other words, what the Banishim said was the following: you are the only Bechor of the Bria, and you will be Neitel Schar Kulam, because you're Orev for them, you are their guarantee. Your Olam Haba must come in conjunction with theirs, as such, or else no one would get Olam Haba. So as an Orev, you must be Matayah, the entire Chalokim which they were Matamer. That's your function now as a Bechor. But what the Banishim said was, the Ika Koyach of Vuchnias, I cannot give to you. He could not give to Avram. All he gave to Avram was the ability to acquire the Bechor, B'tikunoi. Why was that? Avram was told that he would become the Bechor of the Bria. That's true. He took the tachlis of the Bechor. But he did not take the Ika Koyach of the Bechor yet. Why? Because the entire Bria, the Koyach of Vuchnis of the Bria itself was in a state of Ashchosa. This was done by the Umas Ha'olam. Avram had to go and be Metaher, this Ashchosa, which means that in the time of Avram, the Bechor of the Bria, the Bechor status of the world itself, of the Bria, was in a state of Kilkul. It was the tachlis of Avram to take that Bechor B'Kulkuloi and make it a Bechor B'Tikunoi. That was his tachlis, you see. Because he had the tachlis of Bechor, but he didn't have the koyach of the Bechor itself. Who was given the real koyach of the Bechor? Mitzrayim. Why? Because they were Neitel Kilkul Kulam. Mitzrayim took the koyach of the Bechor just as Avram took the tachlis of the Bechor. It was Avram that had to establish the Bechor B'Tikuna in the Bria. But in order to do that, he had to take the actual koyach of the Bechor itself, of the Ruchnis itself, and be Matayr it, because it was in a state of Ashchas, of Kilkul. When Mitzrayim was given the Kilkul of the Bria, Noitel Kilkul Kulam, through the 9/10 Kishuv that they had, they fundamentally were the Bechor of the Bria. They were the de facto Bechor of the Bria. And the Bechor of the Bria at that time was in a state of Kilkul. It was a job of Avram, who was given the Bechor of the Bria de jure, legally, but not factually, to be Matayr this thing, as such. And by being Matayr, he would restore the Bechor of the Bria to a madrega of Tikkun, a madrega of B'Tikunai. You see, that was his tachlis. And that tachlis was supposed to be achieved through Klal Yisrael. Klal Yisrael was supposed to enter into Mitzrayim. One goy who represents a neutral Schar Kulam was supposed to enter into the other goy who was Mitzrayim, who represented the neutral Kilkul Kulam. Klal Yisrael had the tachlis of the Bechor B'Tikunai, and Mitzrayim had the reality of the Bechor B'Kilkuloi. Klal Yisrael was supposed to be Matayah the Bechor B'Kilkuloi, and thus take the Bechor itself, not only in its tachlis, but also in its koyach. So Klal Yisrael went into Mitzrayim itself, and through the Sheba they were Matayah this tremendous kilkul which the Umasodim brought on the Shechina and the entire awe of Ruchnis itself. Once Klal Yisrael had done that, once they had gone through the shibud, what happened? Basically, they were matayah the situation, and what they did was, they took away the Bechor of Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim only had the Bechor because they were noitl kilku kulam. That's why. But the tachlis of the Bechor was in the hands of the Eden. When the Eden went through the shibud and the schusim that they did through the shmir of their loshen and their dress, of their language and their dress, and their names, and through the shibud of Mitzrayim itself, they took away the hashchosa. And when they took away the hashchosa, they took away the awe or the light which was in Mitzrayim, that tremendous kedusha which made Mitzrayim the sovereign of the world, the bechor of the bria. Mitzrayim had the kesser of the bria. They had the crown of the bria because they were the bechor, and therefore they had the power of the bria. But Klal Yisrael took that away. It took away first by taking away its power, and then it took away its sovereignty, its malchus. So fundamentally, this is what Makas Bechoros is. Makas Bechoros is the loss of the bechor of the bria from Mitzrayim. It's the law of the keser, of the sovereignty, of the malchus of the bria, which Mitzrayim had from the koyach of being kilku kulam. They lost that, and they had to give that over to Klal Yisrael. And Klal Yisrael became the bechor of the bria. You see, that's why the mitzvah is given right then and there. Kadosh likol bechor petach orechem. The union of bechor was given right away. You see, right away in the concept, it was given right away in the sense that what? That it's now Klal Yisrael is the bechor of the bria. So therefore we see that Makas Bechoros subscribes to the basic theme of all the Makas, a transfer of kedusha from the klipa to Klal Yisrael. And Makas Bechoros represented the greatest transfer of all, because it represented the transfer of the malchus, of the sovereignty, of the kingship itself. So then we see the sequence of Choshech, Makas Choshech and Makas Bechoros. Makas Choshech was basically the loss of power. When Makas Choshech happened to the Mitzrayim, they realized that they now lost their power. They no longer had the koyach of Ruchnis at all. Makas Bechoros was the loss of the actual keser, the malchus itself. They lost their sovereignty. You see, it's like when a king has a very mighty king, and he has a great army, and there's an enemy which approaches the city, he sends out the army. The army is his koyach, that's his extension, that's his power. But the malchus is the keser, it's himself. And when the army is destroyed in battle, what happens? The king loses what? He loses his army. That's the need of Makas Choshech. The first step in the descent of Egypt was first in the loss of their koyach, and that was in the loss of their army, which is what? In the loss of their shefa. That was Makas Choshech. Once the army was destroyed, it just remains a simple matter now to go to the king and dethrone him, strip him of his malchus, because he has no more koyach. That was Makas Bechoros. Makas Bechoros was what? Was the removal of the crown of the Bechor which existed on Egypt. But it wasn't a direct removal. Moshe didn't come in and just take the Bechor away. Mitzrayim lost it from the schusim of the Eden and from their shibud. Mitzrayim lost their Bechor because they no longer had any claim to the Bechor. There was no more kitrug on Klal Yisrael. There was no more kitrugim on the Bria as such. So therefore they were no more able to hold on to their malchus, to their kingship, to their sovereignty. Then a king is able to hold on to his leadership, to his sovereignty after his army is destroyed. It symbolized the end, the absolute loss of Shlita Mitzrayim. That's why, right after Makas Bechoros, instantly the Rebbeinu Shem said to the Jews, go up and go out. Why? Because they finished their job. The whole tachlis of Klal Yisrael, which was told to Avram, when he said, "Go Yezacho Be'eretz Mitzrayim," they will go into a land Mitzrayim and they will be meshubed in that land. What the Rebbeinu Shem said is they have to go in to take away the Bechor. Well, that's exactly finally what ended by Makas Bechoros. Makas Bechoros was not the final Makkah which convinced the Mitzrayim to let Israel go. That's not what it was. Makas Bechoros was the final revelation to Egypt of their absolute loss of power and Malchus, sovereignty, and the withdrawal and transfer of that power to Klal Yisrael itself. That which was started by the Bris Ben Absalom, that Avtach which was given to Avram Avinu, the Bris Ben Absalom, that his job, his tachlis was to take eventually the Bechor of the Bria, the tachlis and the koyach was finally finished in Makas Bechoros. Makas Bechoros was the revelation. You see, it was the Gilui that this finally transpired. It was the revelation, and it was the open understanding that Mitzrayim now no longer had the Bechor. Hence, once that happened, the ability of every Bechor Mitzrayim no longer existed. Every Bechor Mitzrayim lost his koyach of Bechor. And because he lost the koyach of Bechor, his life was also in the balance. Hence the Satan, the Malach HaMavos, was able to go and kill every Bechor in Mitzrayim. Why? Because every Bechor Mitzrayim lost the critical factor of its Bechor, the critical koyach of its Ruchnius, which existed in the Bechor Mitzrayim, was gone. Hence, the Bechoros themselves lost their physical life as well. Just like the sun, the Mitzrayim lost the physical light of the sun because they lost the Shefa, being beneficiary of the Shefa of the sun. The Bechoros lost their physical life because they had lost the Shefa of the Malchus, the Shefa of this Bechor to the Bria itself. From the Makkos Bechoros, we can understand also other aspects of the Bechor as well, which are very critical. We all know that there's a certain simcha which is made in Klal Yisrael among Yidden, but when a Bechor is born, it's called Pidyon HaBen. And the truth of the matter is, if we really analyze it, it's a very strange simcha. What really happens by a Pidyon HaBen? By a Pidyon HaBen, when a Bechor is born, what we do is we poida that Bechor, we redeem that Bechor, and we take away his Kedusha as a Bechor, and we give it over to the Kohen. Now the strange thing is, why is that a simcha? Why is that a simcha? This is one question. The Chorah, you're taking away something from the Bechor himself, and you're giving it to someone else. Basically, where does the Pidyon HaBen come from? It comes from the Einish of the Yidden in the Midbar by the Chet of the Egel. After the Jews had gotten out of Mitzrayim, they were the Bechor of the Bria, which means that they now had the Koyach, the Tachlis, and they had the Koyach to restore the Tikkun to the Bria itself. And the Bechor of Klal Yisrael itself represented the Ika Koyach of this Ruchnius. So Klal Yisrael as an Ummah was the Bechor of the Bria, and the Bechoros in Klal Yisrael itself, the Peterechem of every woman, were the main people who were involved in the Tikkunim of the nation of Klal Yisrael itself. So there's a distinction between an Ummah, a nation as the Bechor, and the people, the individuals in that nation itself, being the key individuals who would manifest that Bechor through the Bria. When Klal Yisrael took this away from Egypt, they became the Bechor of the Bria, and this was what Hashem wanted with by Avraham. That's what the Haftarah Avraham. And the Bechorim in Klal Yisrael became the main people who would be involved in this koyach. When Klal Yisrael went over to the Chet of the Egel, what happened? They lost it. Fundamentally, by the Chet of the Egel, they were supposed to reach a madrega of what? Of becoming involved in the Yemos Mashiach, and they lost it. We've gone over this a number of times, that the tikkun of the Bria, the tahar of the entire Bria was at stake over here. When Klal Yisrael was meshabed themselves to Mitzrayim, they were matar the entire Inyan of Kilkul. That's why they became the Bechor. The Bechor was now in a state of tikkunoi. The Bria was in a state of tikkunoi. There was no more tumah. There was no more zoyim on the Bria. So Klal Yisrael was ready for the Yemos Mashiach. The Chet Egel destroyed this. It restored the Bria back to an Inyan of the Bechor b'kilkuloi. The Chet of the Egel did to the Bria what the Chet of Adam Rishon did to the Bria. It again locked the Bria into an Arvuvya. It restored the Bria back into an Inyan of what? Of a Bechor b'kilkuloi, where the Koyach of Ruchnis was now in the hands of the Klippa again. No, what would the Midas Adin do in that case? The Midas Adin would say very simple: take the Bechor away. Take it away, they no longer deserve it. So what the Bnei Shem should have done was what? The Bnei Shem should have taken the Bechor away from Klal Yisrael and giving it to another Ummah, or giving it away. But what did the Bnei Shem do? The Bnei Shem did a Mordech Chesed with Klal Yisrael. What he did was, he took it away from Taka the Bechor, but he didn't take it away from Klal Yisrael. Instead, he gave this koyach of Ruchnius, this koyach of Tikkun, to the Levium, to the Shevet Levium. So in other words, the Shevet Levi became the Bechor b'kilkuloi. Shevet Levi is the Bechor b'kilkuloi. They now have the koyach of the Bechor, of the ministry, the ministration of the Kahanim, in the Beit HaMikdash, and the entire Avodah Vuchnis were now in the hands of Levi. Which means that they had the entire Tachlis, the Tafkid of a Bechor. But they were not supposed to have it. The Bechor does not belong to the Levium. It belongs to the Peterechem. It was given to the Levium because of the Chet of the Egel. But basically, the Bechor in the possession of the Levium, the Koyach of Vuchnis, that kind of Koyach of Vuchnis in the possession of the Levium, is a Bechor b'kilkuloi. But that was the chesed that the Baruch Hashem did with Klal Yisrael. He did not take away the Bechor of Klal Yisrael. Instead, he took it away from the Peter Rechem and he gave it to the Levium. And what he did was, every time Klal Yisrael goes to a shibud, or is mechapa on the chet of the egel, a little bit of that schus of Bechor goes back. So that la'asad lavoy, when Klal Yisrael is zeicha to an emes of tahara of the chet of the egel, and removed the zoyama which was brought in the chet of the egel, by the final shibud of the Erev Vav, and so on. What will happen is that the koyach of the Bechor will leave the Levium and go back to the Peter Rechem. You see. What the Baruch Hashem did as a chesed of Klal Yisrael was that he cut off its head and he allowed the guf to live without a head. Can something live without a head? No. If the Baruch Hashem takes a guf and if you take an animal and you cut off its head, the animal must die. Psik reishiv lo yamus. Can you cut off a head and it won't die? Impossible. This is what's supposed to happen to Klal Yisrael. The Baruch Hashem should have cut off its head, its inyan of Bechor, and Klal Yisrael should have died without the koyach. But what the Baruch Hashem did was he took the head and he put it into the guf itself, into a different part of the guf. He made one of the feet the head. That's what he did. How is that possible? How can you live? A head is a head. How can a being live, a guf live, when its foot is the head? That's what the Baruch Hashem did. He made the foot into the head and he allowed the guf to still live. Take a chicken, cut its head off and make the foot its head. Is such a thing possible? No, Mitzvah Din, it's impossible. But that's exactly what he did to Klal Yisrael. He cut off the Bechor, he took away the Bechor from the Peter Rechem, and he gave it to a different section of Klal Yisrael, the Levium, and he made them the Bechor. Which means that from the time of the Chet and Egel until the end of the Iskuf of the Mashiach ben Yosef, when the Tahara is complete, Klal Yisrael is like a body living where its head is on the underside. Its head is by its feet. It's a perverse Bechor. The guf of Klal Yisrael is perverse because its head is upside down. But this was the chesed of the Baruch Shalom. Better put the head upside down and let the person have a very severe defects, physical defects, than take off the head and not give it at all. Then the animal will die. And this is what the Baruch Shalom did. He took the head, the Bechor, and he gave it to a different part of the body, the Levium. And he allowed the body to live in that state, in the Bechor, but the Kilkulo, he allowed it to live. And every time Klal Yisrael goes to the Tahara, involved in this thing, the Asad Lovoy, when the time comes and there's an emes of tikkun of the Zoyamon, there's no more Kilkuloi, there's no more tum in the sense, then the head will leave the feet and go back to the top of the body. That's what will happen. The guf will be restored b'tikkunoi. This is the inyan, and that's why we have a simcha by Pidyon Aben. Why? The Pidyon Aben is not a simcha chas v'shalom that you take the Bechor away from the Peter Rechem. There's no simcha when the Bechor b'tikkunoi becomes a Bechor b'kilkuloi. There's no simcha what? When the head is cut off. But there is a simcha when the head is cut off and the animal still lives. That's an emes of simcha. And that's an inyan of the Anogas HaYichud. So the pnimis of the simcha of a Pidyon Aben, you see, is the fact that the Baruch Hashem allowed Klal Yisrael to retain the Bechorah. You see, except that the Bechorah was in a perverse form. He did not take it away. And that's how he treated Klal Yisrael, and he did not treat the other Ummahs of the Olam. With the other Ummahs, he took away the Bechor and Gansen. With Klal Yisrael, he simply kept it, and simply put it in a place of Golus for a while. And then Klal Yisrael should be Zoicha by the Maisim to restore, to be Matar this, and restore the Bechor b'tikunoi. This is the emes of Simcha of a Pidyon Aben. That Klal Yisrael is Zoicha to live, even in a state of Ashchosa. That the state of Ashchosa is good for the Gul of Klal Yisrael, and allows the ultimate Yeshua to happen. The Torah itself becomes the Yeshua. The Baruch Hashem is a hidden God, whose pearl is Yeshua's, through what appears to be a complete hashchasa. There's another important inyan which is very important to discuss. And that's again, going back to the 10 makas itself. The Torah says that the 10 makas were written on the staff of Moshe Rabbeinu itself, among other things. There were the 10 makas which were written on the staff. And we understand that the staff basically was the symbol of the status of the Bria, whether it's in the state of a Nochosh or in the state of a Mater. The fact that the 10 makas are written on the staff shows us that there's something much deeper about those 10 makas than would apparently meet the eye. Because the staff of Moshe Rabbeinu was not only a staff which existed at that point in time, and which was used at that point in time to be sholet al Allah, but the staff of Moshe Rabbeinu is fundamentally the staff of the ultimate Yemos Mashiach as well. Because it says clearly that ultimately, there's a message that says that staff will be restored ultimately to the Mashiach himself, and he will use that staff again to bring the Gula Asidah. But if the 10 Makkos are labeled and described on that staff according to their names, is a simon that the 10 Makkos also not only apply to the Gula Rishona, but in some way the 10 Makkos apply to the Gula Asidah. And what we'd like to understand is, how is this possible? This is a very radical concept. Nowhere is this really mentioned. But the truth is, it's quite obvious, simply by the linkage and the association of the Makkos to the staff of Moshe Rabbeinu. It shows that the ultimate Gula will happen in a very similar fashion, in certain ways, also to the derech of 10 Makkos. Let's explain this. What we basically said was that Eretz Mitzrayim took the Kedusha of the 10 Hashpos of the world. That Kedusha was Nichnas B'Sech HaKlipa. It enlarged the union of the Tferes and the Oiz in the hands of Mitzrayim itself. What was the manifestation of the Tferes and the Oiz of Mitzrayim? The manifestation of the Tferes and Oiz, the Kedusha, in the Klip of Mitzrayim, was through the fact, number one, that Mitzrayim was the greatest military might on the world, and the greatest mutzlach in terms of Olam Hazeh, that's their Oiz. And it also manifests itself in terms of their Tferes. First, in the sense that they had the greatest hasaga of kishuv, you see, and koichas hara of all the ummos olam. By having the hasagas of this kishuv, and by being able to be over that vazor, they were able to directly access in the pneumius of the bria, you see. So therefore, it's clear that Mitzrayim had direct access, were connected to the pneumius of the bria through the koichas of kishuv itself. But it was Kedusha that fundamentally they were able to use, even though they themselves were not really aware of that. Now what do we say? We say that when Moshe Rabbeinu came and was poiled the 10 Makkos through the Koyach of the Bnei Shalom, what does each Makkah represent? Each Makkah represents basically a loss of power of the Mitzrayim in that particular Shefa. Each one of the Makkos was a loss of the Kedusha, which was given to the Mitzrayim through that Shefa. And what Moshe demonstrated to the Mitzrayim was that up to now they had the shlita of those 10 Hashpos, and therefore they had the shlita of the Kedusha to be poiled their kishuv. But now that shlita is no more theirs, and the Kedusha is taken away. And what Moshe did was that each time a Kedusha was taken away, each time one of the Hashpos of the Bria was taken away from Mitzrayim, that Hashpor, that Kedusha was now able to be used to create a situation, a Makkah on Mitzrayim itself. This is exactly the process which will happen La'asad Lavoy in the Gula Asidah. La'asad Lavoy, again, this will happen. Moshe Rabbeinu was the Mashiach ben Yosef of his time, and we have in Mazda what that means. That fundamentally Moshe Rabbeinu was Mashiach ben Yosef because it remains Mashiach ben Yosef, the central focus or the central function of Tahara, to be Mataya, the Bria from the Zayma, to retrieve the Kedusha and the Eretz which fell into a Klippa, to be masakin the world from its kilkulov, and finally, most important of all, to be masakin the ore of the shefa from its kilkul, and to restore the Torah in its emes hasaga and its emes koyach. This is the essence of the union of Mashiach ben Yosef, and this is what Moshe Rabbeinu did. He did the tahara of the bria how, because fundamentally he was the apex or the climax of the union of Yosef up to that time, and he took Klal Yisrael, goy b'kerev goy. He took them out of Mitzrayim, out of the Shlita that Klippa, and then he was Megala the Torah to them, or Megala the new ore that was given down to the world at that time, which was no longer in that Klippa. La'asad Lavoy, this is the same tachas of the Mashiach ben Yosef as well. What will he do? Again, he will remove the Klal Yisrael from the Ummos Olam, the union of Goy b'kerev Goy. He will be Mekabetz Goyus, but this time from the entire Bria itself, and Matah, the Ummos Olam completely, so that Klal Yisrael is totally freed from the Ummos Olam. He will also release what else? He will release as well also the Or Torah, which is the Torah B'tzuz HaKetzer, the Orish Mashiach at that time. But the interesting question, if he has to release this from the Klippa, where is these Orish now? Where is the ultimate Orish of the Orish Mashiach, which for us in Lavoy will become the Yerusha of Klal Yisrael? Obviously, it exists in the Klippa itself. Just like the original Or of Kedusha existed in Mitzrayim, and the Tferes and Oiz was the Shlit of Mitzrayim in their Klippa, the the Tiferes and Oiz, which is now locked up as Man Azeh, which will be freed ultimately by the Mashiach ben Yosef, is also locked up in the Umas Olam. So what's the difference? The difference is in the manifestation of that ore in the Klippa. In those days, in the days of the Gula Rishona by Mitzrayim, the essence of Ruchnius, the essence of the Hasogas Yichud at that time, as we said, was direct access. Meaning that the people at that time were in direct contact with the Pneumius of the Bria. They saw Ruchnius, they felt it directly. They had Shayach to Nevuah, they had Shayach to Kishuv, they had Shayach to Nisim, to things L'mayim Teva. They had Shayach to Ruchnius in a direct way. Therefore, the Kedoshim, the Tzaddikim at that time, when they had Shayach to Ruchnius, it was directly to Kedusha. And when the Rishoyim had Shayach to Ruchnius, it was also directly to Kedusha. How? Through Kishuv and Avodah Zorah. Kishuv and Avodah Zorah were the Hamshocha of the Neshama itself to the Satan. It was the way that the Satan, the Yetzirah, manifested himself at that time. It was what's called an association with the Pnimis of the Bria. That's the difference between that time and now. In other words, the concept of Uzucha Vashevi V'Tvat Chviyatzor existed then as it exists now. The difference was the manifestation of that Kedusha B'Seich HaTumah. In that time, the Kedusha B'Seich HaTumah was in the Pnimius of the Bria, so that the Kedusha and the Tumah together was clearly perceived in its Alvovia, and Mitzrayim was able to access that Kedusha through the Klippa by its Kishuv and by its Avodah Zorah. Today, the Umas Olim cannot do that. Instead, they access the Kedusha B'Seich HaTumah through Chochmah, not through Nevuah, but through Chochmah, not through Kishuv, but through science and technology. It's a whole different Yesod, but the concept is the same. The Tiferes Salah today exists in the tremendous shlita that the Goyim have over the Tiferes of the Bria, the Chochmah, and the Oiz. It's technology. That's where the Kedusha B'Seich HaTumah. In the same vein, the Mashiach ben Yosef, La'asad Lava, will come and will retrieve the Kedusha in that sense also. How does he do it? He will again bring 10 makas. But the makas that he will bring will not be makas that have to do with what? With the Panimis of the Bria. It will not have to do with going to things L'mayim Teva. The Mashiach ben Yosef will not free the Kedusha by doing makas or nisim, geluyim, or moisim in that real sense. Because that's only shaykh when the Bria has shaykhs to Moisim. When the Bria has shaykhs to the Pnimius directly, then the Geula manifests itself through Moisim. When the Golas, when the Klippa manifests itself through what? Through Kishuv, which is the direct access to Ruchnius, then the Geula manifests itself through what? Through Nisim and through things L'mayim Teva. This connected this. But also the Klippa does not manifest itself through Kishuv or through direct association with Ruchnius. Rather, it manifests itself through Chochmah and through technology. So therefore, ultimately, the Gula will have to come in the same way. So that basically the 10 makas, which are the restoration of the Shefa in the future time, will come through Chochmah and through a new Koyach. So the Mashiach ben Yosef will again war against Umas Olam with 10 makas. But they're not 10 makas of Kishuv or of Nisim. They're makas of Chochmah. The Mashiach ben Yosef will be Magala new Hasogas of Chochmah, new Koiches, which the world has never seen. He will take the Kedusha which now exists in the Chochmah of the Goyim now, in their science and technology, and take it out of that and put it back in the Torah and be Magala, the Pnimius of the Bria itself, in terms of its Chochmah. You see. And he will do that in 10 successive stages according to the 10 different Ashfors which were used to create the world in the same way. This is the meaning of the 10 makas on the mat of Moshe. Just like Moshe Rabbeinu freed the Kedusha through a gradual demonstration of the impotence of Mitzrayim. So, La'asad Lavoy, the Mashiach ben Yosef, will also restore the Kedusha by a gradual demonstration of the impotence of the Umas Olam. Except that the impotence of the Umas Olam will not be demonstrated through direct access or Kishuv, rather will be demonstrated through Chochmah. And at each point, what the Mashiach ben Yosef will do, will take the Nekudas of the Kedusha and will be Magala new sources of Chochmah, which were never seen before, on 10 different Madregas, one higher than the other. So that finally the Goyim will come to the same Hasoga now that they did then. Just like the Mitzrayim came to the Hasoga, that what? That Einoid Mevado Afilu B'Chshafim, you see, and therefore the whole Koyach and Tiferes has in its underpinnings Kedusha. So the Umas Olam will realize also now with all this science and technology, they will come to the Hasaga You see, that their entire science and technology as it exists today is nothing more than a reflection of the Kedusha itself, but it's the Kedusha in the Tumah that they possess. Let's understand what we mean by a future Makkah. It won't be a Makkah of Moifes or Nisim, it's a Makkah of Chokhmah. Because what will happen is that through the Kedusha that used to exist in the Goyim and now is back in the Torah, by being Master of the Torah Yeshna, the Torah will suddenly open up and reveal all those critical problems and issues which will never be able to be solved by man. Suddenly the whole Hester of the Bria, the Hester of the Hashkocha, the Hester of the design of the Bria itself will be suddenly open, and which all scientists cannot even begin to understand. And once that Chochmah is mefusam, a whole new state of technology will exist that the mind of man cannot even be masig now. Just like Moshe Rabbeinu was able to do Moisim, that the Mitzrayim could not be masig from their koyach of Kishuv, the Osalova, the Mashiach ben Yosef will be Magala Chochmah, you see, and consequent koychas, that the Umas Olim today, the greatest nations of the world today, the scientists, cannot be masig, even exist in Chochmah, or even in technology itself. You see, that's the Indian of the Makkos, Lo Asad Lavoy. The Makkos of the Moisim Lo Asad Lavoy are Moisim Legaba Chochmah. And it's through these matters, through the moifet of Chokhmah, that the Bria will be zecher to the what? To the Madrega, Umolet Deis Hashem Kamayim Lion Lechasim. You see, Das, the Mashiach ben Yosef will restore the Das to the Bria, Chokhmah, which is the most powerful thing. But where will he get the Chokhmah? Science and technology represent the koyach of the Umas Olam. It represents an ability to look into the Bria and be masig Yehuda to a certain extent. What their masik is the yichud of the Bria without accepting the yichud of the Borei. That's essentially what science and technology is. However, what it is the ability of a certain level of Gili Yechudai. That ability comes from the Kedusha itself. The ability to be masik Yechudai through science and technology, through the Tiferes and Oiz, comes from Kedusha itself, and this is what the Umas Olam have. The Umas Olam got this in the time of Newton and Galileo. That's when there was a tremendous dispassus of this. But basically, the koyach that they have from science and technology comes from the usurped Kedusha that Klal Yisrael should have itself. The Asad Lavoy, the Mashiach ben Yosef, will restore this Hasoga to the Torah itself. So what will happen is that science and technology will remain, but it will be seen that science and technology is a minuscule amount of the ultimate Chokhmah which is truly available and which they don't begin to tefes or understand. Right now, scientists and engineers believe that they're on a very great level of Chokhmah and a very great level of applications of that Chokhmah, which is technology. But what they don't understand is that the entire scientific technology which they have only is there because of the amount of Kedusha which they've usurped, you see, which is not really a great deal of Kedusha. When the Mashiach ben Yosef takes back that Kedusha and puts it into the oil of Torah itself, and from the Torah, he's Megala a new Chokhmah. What kind of Chokhmah? He's Megala not only what? The laws of science, but he shows how the laws of science connect to the very design of the Bria itself. He shows not only what the laws of science are, but why the laws of science were made that way. What's called the internal necessity of the laws themselves. And by doing that, he opens up the ability of mankind to do things technologically, which were never even thought of or heard of. Things which are considered absolute science fiction, or perhaps absolutely impossible, suddenly become easily accessible once we understand the very inner fiber of the natural law itself, scientific law itself. You see, that's what the Mashiach ben Yosef will do. But he will do that by taking the Kedusha and putting it in the Torah, and from the Torah we will see this type of Chokhmah. But he will do it in 10 successive stages. You see, as the Umas Olam lose their koyach of Kedusha in 10 successive stages, and therefore demonstrate their gradual impotence, the Mashiach ben Yosef will take each level of Kedusha which the Umas Olam has lost, and Megala a new area of Chokhmah, or a new koyach of Chokhmah, which suddenly deepens the understanding of the Bria exponentially. This is essentially what will happen in that particular time. And once he's done that, once he's removed all the Kedusha from the Umas Olam, it doesn't mean they'll lose their science and technology any more than the Egyptians lost their ability for Kishuv, even after the 10 Makkos. They were still the same Machashvim, but what they lost was what they saw was that all the cause of Kishuv were a very small amount of the true available Oiz and Tiferes that existed in Kedusha, you see. and that their entire Kishuv itself was based on that Kedusha. The Ummah Ha'olam will understand that today as well. That all their science and technology is based fundamentally on the Kedushas HaTorah, on the inner Gili of the Torah itself. And that when that Kedusha is finally restored, the Hasogas and the Chochmas which become evolved will be vastly, exponentially greater than anything all the Ummah Ha'olam have ever been able to figure out in their science and technology. And it's with this new Chachma that the Mashiach Ben Yosef will be able to spread the Das of the Bria. That's where it comes when it says Umola Deis Hashem K'mayim Liyom Chasim. That what? That the Mashiach Ben Yosef will through this all be Megala the Yichud HaBorei, so that the entire world is filled with the Das of the Bonisham. Where is he going to take this Das from? Where is he going to access this Chachma from? The access to this Chachma is what? It's from the Or itself, and it's from the Or which exists in the present what? In the present Klippa. You see. So we will again see an exchange of Kedusha from Klippa to the higher level of the Kedusha itself. Just like the Kedusha was removed from the Klippa of Mitzrayim and became unadulterated and purified and was mizgaba to the Madrega, when Moshe Rabbeinu was able to turn over the entire Bria and its mofsim, al-yedei what? Al-yedei nisim and mofsim. You see. The Atzalavite, the Mashiach Ben Yosef, will turn over the entire Bria by again confiscating the Kedusha from the clip of the Ummah Ha'olam in their science and technology, expanding it to the Madrega, where suddenly Chochmah is seen on a level which it has never even been imagined. Where the entire world will say, with absolute certainty. Could you be massing the type of Chochmah which is required to do this? You know what's necessary to take a Chochmah in the Bria, to go to every person in the world and convince him with absolute certainty that there exists a Bnei Shalom, a Klal Yisrael, a Torah and so on? How do you do this? How do you do this? How can you eradicate meanness from the world with Chochmah? Can you imagine the Madrega of Chochmah which is necessary to be able to do that? When the Ummah Ha'olam in their Klippa say that we already have the greatest level of science and technology, when we can go to the moon and do all these things? You see? That's their meanness. Their sense of science and technology sponsors their meanness. This is the Gilui ultimately of the Mashiach Ben Yosef. It's the exact same thing. It's the same process. It's Kedusha going from Klippa to back to a pure form. You see. But the difference, and it's going in 10 different stages. And it goes by a withdrawal process. It leaves the Klippa in 10 different stages, so the Klippa begins to experience a gradual 10-stage Chalisha, or impotence. The only difference between now and then, you see, between these times, between Mashiach Ben Yosef at this time, and Moshe Rabbeinu with Mashiach Ben Yosef at that time, is simply the manifestation of that Kedusha and that Klippa. In that time, the manifestation was through what? Was through things l'mayla m'derech hateva. It was a manifestation of access to a pnimis of the Bria, directly to Ruchnis itself. Hence, the Klippa manifests itself through Kishuv, you see, and the Kedusha manifests itself through Moifsim. But today, it's a different manifestation. You see, the Kedusha the Klippa manifests itself today through science and technology as the greatest level of Yeshiv Mavadoi. You see, as the greatest weapon of the Sultan to give man the image of a Yeshiv Mavadoi. That's where it's at now. The Atzad Lavai, what will happen is, this Kedusha will then be removed from that Klippa, and what will happen is, man will reach a stage of Tiferes, of Chochmah, which leaves the Bria with an absolute knowledge of the Bnei Shalom, in a way which has never been done before. This is what we see when the 10 Makkos is on the staff of Moshe. That's its soy, you see. In the sense that the process is very similar, except one is through what? The union of Nevuah, and the other is through the union of Chochmah. In order to finally fully understand the notion of Yetzias Mitzrayim, we have to speak about one more thing. We spoke about the whole union of the Mata L'Nochash, and the Nochash Mata. We spoke about the 10 plagues, the 10 Makkos, and what really went on. What we have to understand is the last Makkah itself, Makkos Becheres. Now, we gave basically an understanding of Makkos Becheres, in the sense that it was the transfer of the Bechor, the Kilkuloi, the Bechor to the Ummah was Kilkul Kulam, to the Bechor B'tikunoi, which is the Bechor to the Tzcha Kulam. But the truth of the matter is, if we examine how did that transition take place, how did Klal Yisrael able to finally take the Bechor from Mitzrayim And the central mechanism which allowed that transfer was the Korban Pesach itself. And in the Korban Pesach we see some very, very important things. What was the meaning of the Korban Pesach? Well, before we can understand the Korban Pesach, we have to understand a little more about the Avodah Zarah of Mitzrayim. We said before that fundamentally Mitzrayim worshipped the sun through its god, the main god Amun-Ra, through the sun god, because the basic its shefa came from the sun, and they had the shlita on the essential shefa of the Bria. We said also that Amun-Ra had the figure of a ram, Aries, the ram, and therefore the sign of Aries, the ram, is the month of Nisan. That's why Nisan was the main month of Egypt. It was the first month of Egypt in terms of its basic koyach, its zodiacal sign. After the 9 Makkos, after the Makkos Choshech, Mitzrayim lost its koyach. They were finally up to the last point of losing what we said, their shlita, or their malchus, their sovereignty, which is the bechor of the Bria. But right before that happened, the Sultan runs up to the Baruch Shem and says, wait a minute. It's true that Klal Yisrael was Omed Murdik Shibudim. It's true. It's true they also have Schusim. They want Mishana their shame. They want Mishana their Loshen. They want Mishana their Malbush. That's also true. It's true they have Schusavas. But it's not enough. You see, this has been enough to finally take the Koyach away from Mitzrayim. But if you want to take the crown itself, the Malchus, the Keser, you can't take the Keser. I still have what's left of the Kitrug. Why? Because thought Klal Yisrael was over the Avodah Zarah of Mitzrayim. You see, their Chosim are too minimal to make such a transfer of Bechor. They were over the Avodah Zarah, they were over the Ram. They were over the Amun-Ra, just like the Mitzrayim one done. And fundamentally, Avodah Zarah is a monumental chet. There's no way they're going to take the chet, the Bechor. You see, why are you taking away the Bechor of Mitzrayim? Because it was over the Avodah Zarah? Why? Because it was worship, the essence of that Kishuv, the essence of that Koyach, which was in Amun-Ra, which was in the Aries, which was in the Ram God. You see, the Ram God, Amun-Ra, the God of the sun, represented the clip of Mitzrayim, the 9/10 of the Kishuv. It represented the access that Mitzrayim had to Ruchnias. Klal Yisrael accessed the same Ruchnias, they accessed the same Klippa, you see. So what are you going to do? You're going to dethrone Amun-Ra? Fine, dethrone Amun-Ra. You'll dethrone Amun-Ra for the Mitzrayim? Fine. But Klal Yisrael also worshipped Amun-Ra. You see, why should they be zeicha to the Bechor? Why should they be zeicha to a greater life when both were involved in the same form of worship? So the Baruch Shem said, okay, I abide by your kitrug. That's true. The din tak is shoylet in this case. So let's give Klal Yisrael one more schus, one more thing. And in order to take the Bechor, which is what? Which is in order to take the crown from Hester Yechudoi to Gili Yechudoi, I have to put Klal Yisrael in the matzav of a Gili Yechudoi, but through Bechira. So what the Baruch Shem said, I want you to take the Ram of Egypt, the God of Egypt, and I want you to be Makavet in my name. You see. Now Klal Yisrael saw this thing, it was very frightening, because they were taking the God of Egypt itself, and of course they were very afraid that even though Mitzrayim had lost the great of Korach, who knows? You know what I mean? When you live in an Ummah for 210 years with incredible shlita, you don't think twice about the fact that someday they won't be able to rejuvenate themselves and come after you. So it was still a tremendous pachad. So Klal Yisrael had to demonstrate in true Mesiras Nefesh, a Mesiras Nefesh that Einot Mavadoi Afilu B'Chshafen, that Amun-Ra is not God. What do you mean by Amun-Ra? That the Kishuv, that the Klippa of Amun-Ra, that the incredible Ruchnistika high and ecstasy that used to be associated with the Avodah of Amun-Ra is false. You see. But rather, the Emes Avodah is to the Baruch Shem himself. This is where the Avodah is. That the Pnimis of the Ruchnius, that the Pnimis of Kedusha is the Baruch Shem himself. And therefore, this is what we have to be over. And that was the test of Klal Yisrael. And the Baruch Shem said that Klal Yisrael sacrificed Amun-Ra, sacrificed Aries, and so on. If you can do that, you will remove the last possibility of a kitrug, you see, and you will be zeicha to the Bechor itself. And Klal Yisrael Taka did it. They Taka did it, and they were zeicha to the Bechor. They were only been a soyin, and they exchanged one god for another. They exchanged the god of Sheker, the Klippa, the Kishuv itself, the Avodah Zarah of Amun-Ra, for the Baruch Shem himself, the Einot Mavadoi, the Gili Yuchot. And because of that, they were zurcha to the Kesser of that Yichud, which to accept the Bechor of the Bria, to be masham themselves in Takas Chanfei Shechina, in accepting the Hanor of that Gil Yehuda itself. But the matter was not so simple, because even though they were able to remove the Kitrug, it wasn't that simple, because what they had to do, they had to take the dam of that Korban Pesach, and they had to put it on the lintel, on the Pesach, you see, of each doorway, so that when the Mashchus goes to Mitzrayim, he would overlook or pass over, you see, the houses of Klal Yisrael. What does that show us? That shows us very clearly that the Mitzvah Din was toying on Klal Yisrael and Mitzrayim, that the Mitzvah Din wanted to destroy both. You see, that if Mitzrayim lost its Bechor, Klal Yisrael would not be Zercha to its Bechor. The Bechor is belongs to neither, because they're both over the Avodah Zarah. You see. So therefore, you cannot give the Kesef of Gili Hasogas Yichud to an Ummah that was over the Avodah Zarah. You cannot do that. So what the Baruch was Mitzvah, that through the mysterious nefesh of Klal Yisrael and through the Nesoyim, the blood on the doorway saved them. Because as the Mashchus went by, what do you mean the Mashchus? As the Din went by, as Mekatik went to every door, and he was determined at each point, there was a bezdin in every door of Mitzrayim, and he connected every door of Jews. We can imagine as if there was mamash a bezdin sitting in front of each one. The bezdin Shemala. In front of the Mitzrayim, the bezdin would say, you've lost your power, you've lost your shlita, you're finished. So suddenly the Bechor would be taken away from Mitzrayim. That's all. Then there was a bezdin in front of every door of the Eden. And the Din said to each Yiddish Shtub, you also have no right to Bechor. But suddenly the Mashchus or the Mekatig would look on the door and see the blood. He would see the schus that each house had from its Korban Pesach, and the Kitrug was gone. You see, he couldn't say anything. It was like a person almost having a taina, but he had to stop. You see, it's like the Mekatig said, but he couldn't get the words out of his mouth. Which shows us that the transfer of the Bechor from Mitzrayim to Klal Yisrael was very subtle, and was essentially a withdrawal, a slow withdrawal from one to another, but not a confiscation. If Klal Yisrael had been a soyan in Mitzrayim, to whoever discussed them, they would have ripped the Bechor away from Mitzrayim. They wouldn't have needed a Korban Pesach. They wouldn't have to sneak behind the Mashchus, you see, and suddenly hide themselves so that the din is not shirlet on them. They would have gone straight to each Bechor of Mitzrayim, taken the Kedusha of each Bechor, and that Bechor would have died, and they would have usurped it and confiscated by right, by din. Klal Yisrael could not do that. Instead they had to hide. You see, they had to hide behind the last chus, you see, which was the Bechira of what? Of the Korban Pesach. And that was able to be muscle them, and it was able for the Bechor to be transferred. But it was transferred very subtly and almost invisibly to Klal Yisrael. But the transfer was complete, because the Baruch said to Yidden what? Which chodesh was that? Which chodesh was that? That was Chodesh Nisan. But wait a minute, Chodesh Nisan used to be the zodiacal sign of Aries the Ram. It was the Egyptian god. That's exactly. Not only did we transfer the Bechor, we transferred the zodiacal sign, so that now you're shoylet over Aries, and you're shoylet over the sun. It's your shlita. That which used to be the power of Mitzrayim is your power, and it's represented by the fact that your chodesh, the first chodesh. What do you mean your first chodesh? Why is Nisan the first chodesh? It's not Nisan itself which is the first chodesh. It's the koyach of Nisan. It's the sign. It's the shefa which is associated with Nisan is now your chodesh, because you now control the shefa, and whoever controls the shefa of Nisan controls the Bechor of the Bria. The Bechor of the Bria lies in the month of Nisan. It lies in the zodiac sign of Aries. That's where the Bechor lies. When the Bria was in the state of the Bechor, B'Kulkuloi and Mitzrayim was the Bechor, they had shlit over Nisan. They had shlit over the Ram, over Aries, and they had shlit over the sun. But then when it was transferred to Klal Yisrael had shlit over Nisan. Over what? Over Aries, and finally over the sun. You see, because Nisan is the shefa of the Bechor Bria itself. There's another very big yesod that we see from this as well. Something which is very strange. Because when Klal Yisrael did the Korban Pesach was an exchange for the worship of Amun Ra. But let's look at it very closely. I've explained this before, and it's very important to understand. Avodah Zarah was a true Yetzer Hara. It was a true Yetzer Hara. In what way? In the sense that the Satan or the Yetzer Hara did not go to the Guf. We experienced the Yetzer Hara by our bodies, by our taivas of the Guf, basically. You see, we experienced a certain level of Yetzer Hara through Gaiva. But the Yetzer Hara in those days was different. The Yetzer Hara in those days had much more direct access to the Neshama, and the Yetzer Hara was able to connect the Neshama to Ruchnius almost directly. But it was a false Ruchnius. It was the Ruchnius of Tumah. You see, that was the type of Avodah Zarah. The type of Avodah Zarah was the type of every man's Neshama for Ruchnius itself. You see, except that he didn't know which Ruchnius he wanted. He had to be boicha between the Ruchnius, which is in the Klippa, the Kedusha in the Klippa, or the Ruchnius, which is Mamash in the Hecha Kedusha. But in both cases, it was the affinity of the Neshama for Ruchnius itself. The people at that time were able to feel Ruchnius. They were able to get the high from Ruchnius itself directly. You see, when the Buddha said to Klal Yisrael to what? To do the Korban Pesach, he told Klal Yisrael to be makriv a Korban to me, you see. But fundamentally, what the Korban was the exact same type of experience. It was an exchange. The Hanor, the Simcha, the ecstasy of Avodah Zarah was transferred to the Hanor, to the Simcha, to the ecstasy of the Korban Pesach. And mark very carefully what I say. We think that when the Yidden went ahead in the Beis HaMikdash, they were makriv kabbonos. They killed a bunch of animals, and they had certain kaporos in the Shemayim, but that there was no real personal experience in relation to that. You see, because we understand basically now that what's a korban? If you have a chet, or if you want to bring a korban shlomim for her dog, you go to the Beis HaMikdash, you bring an animal, the animal therefore is taken, it goes to a dal de avodas, zvikas adam, and the aktoras emum, the bottle, whatever the situation is, and what does the person experience? Fine, he brought a korban, so the korban now is instead of him. What's happening to the person? Well, basically, he's content with the knowledge that he's achieved the kapora, or he's achieved the shlemus, and that's the end of it. That's not what it is. That's not what the kabbonos were. The kabbonos at that time, until the churban, the Vayis Rishon, was a direct ruchnistic experience. Just like the Avodah Zarah was a direct ruchnis experience, where a sense of hanon, ecstasy evolved. When the Yidden at that time, before the Churban Vayis Rishon, would be makriv kabbonos, they would experience directly an incredible kedusha and dveikus, mamash, a point of almost being neneh from Zivah Shechina directly. We cannot be masik such as that because we don't have that ability anymore. Our neshamas are not that great. Our neshamas do not access the pnimis of the bria or the kedusha of the bria directly. We can't get high on kedusha, to use the vernacular. They were able to. That's what the Korban Pesach. The Korban Pesach is megal to us the soid and the pnimis of the Korban Shlomim itself, and all the kabbonos. That when the Yidden were makriv kabbonos, the kabbonos they were makriv was in lieu or instead of the Avodah Zarah. But the Avodah Zarah itself was not a stama ritual. It wasn't an empty ritual. It was a ritual where the neshama of the Ovid Avodah Zarah actually connected to Ruchnius directly and felt a tremendous surge of Ruchnius. But it was a Ruchnius connected with Gaiva. It was a Ruchnius of a Yeshua Mavadai. It was an enormous, omnipotent feeling connecting with a very high level of Ruchnius. We don't have that feeling anymore. But the Yidden who were makriv kabbonos in that time felt the same thing, except that the Ruchnius that they felt was a Ruchnius that left them with a feeling of Eilid Mavadai. You see? And it was a much higher level. That's what the Korban Pesach tells us. The Korban Pesach tells us that when the Baruch Hashem exchanged the Korban Pesach for the Avodah Zarah of Mitzrayim, he not only exchanged the rituals, the ceremonies, the Avodah of the Korban, but he exchanged the inner pnimis, the inner ruchnistic experience itself. And from that experience we can understand what the kabbonos really are. That the kabbonos are not just a series of avodas or operations as such, designed to yield just some basic objectives. But fundamentally the most powerful objective that was reached, especially in the Korban Pesach, especially in the Korban Shlomim, which the Korban Pesach was part of, you see, was a direct feeling of Ruchnius. A direct feeling. And when Klal Yisrael achieved a tremendous level of Kedusha on a personal, subjective level, when they were makriv kabbonos. We do not understand it now. To us it sounds like a bunch of empty rituals. But that's not what it was. Because again, the people at that time had access directly to Ruchnius, Lemaisa. So all the Ruchnistic activities, whether it was Avodah Zarah or was it Kabbonos, to the Baruch Hashem, all of these were directly ecstatic experience. This is the story of the Kabbalah itself. And to understand this is to understand what Seder Kachim is really about, and what Ori Mei HaYolonu, what the Yidden once had. It's not a slaughterhouse just killing animals for the purpose of a kapora. The meaning of Kabbalah, the Hakrova of a Korban, is a path to Ruchnis itself. It's a direct experience of the most powerful surge of Ruchnis. We are no longer zercha to that. Because when Chazal banished the Yetzer of Avodah Zarah, we also began to lose the ability of the Simcha of the Korbanos. It's the same thing. Because you cannot experience one without the other. Once the koyach of direct access was taken away, it was taken away in all spheres. So the Yidden who were Makav Kabbonis and were Bias Sheni were totally different than the Yidden who were Makav Kabbonis and Bias Rishon. The experience was like night and day. To hear a person in the second base of Mikdash to describe the Makav as a Kabbonis with one in the first base of Mikdash is to hear two different accounts of the same event. Two totally different experiences. And today, when we have no Kabbonis at all, we can barely understand what it is. And sometimes it was Zeicha, through our Tefillah, we can do. And why is Tefillah? Because the truth of the matter is, Tefillah is a very powerful vehicle for Dveikus. It's come out among the most powerful. And that's essentially the Hanor of the Kabbonis, Dveikus. And what the Baruch Hashem said is, now we no longer can have a Dveikus in these mechanisms. Your Dveikus lies in Tefillah. And sometimes when you're very high in Tefillah, when you're very much into Tefillah and you're very dovet to what's being said, you can be malgish a little bit of the ruchnis of the Dveikus, which was once magnified thousands and thousands of times by those people bringing Kabbonis. But the mechanism we have today for that ecstasy is Tefillah itself. You see. And that tells us the bezyonis, in a sense, that we mavaza when we don't daven kahogim, and we talk, and we do all these things in Tefillah, and we just listen to Chazal Shas without saying Amen. When we're not involved in the Tefillah, what we don't realize, it's like we're stepping on the Hakrov itself. We are stepping on the one mechanism which allows us to be Mekasher to Ruchnis itself. It's the last mechanism. It's the mechanism of the Hesed. It's the mechanism that was given to us in the Klip of Edom, in the Klip of Esav. Because the Baruch Hashem said in the first Churban Beis HaMikdash to Klal Yisrael, you are no longer Zoicha to be Margish Ruchnius in such a level. I take it away. And the people of the second base of Mikdash, the Baruch Hashem said, I allow you the mechanism, but you no longer will ever again feel the power of that surge, that Ruchnistic surge that the people of the first base of Mikdash felt. And finally, to the people who lost all the base of Mikdash, which we have now, the Baruch Hashem said, you will no longer feel anything what they felt, but I will allow you to feel a nitzutz. I will let the sparks with you. But that spark is only accessible by the mechanism which has supplanted the Kabbonis. And what is that mechanism? That's the mechanism of Tefillah itself. That's the koyach of Tefillah. You see, that is the only mechanism which in some way we can reproduce what we once had before. And from this a person can begin to understand the enormous chashivas of Tefillah itself. What we've discussed up to now is the Gula, the Yetzias Mitzrayim itself. Now we come to the last phase, which is Kriyas Yamsuf. And we ask ourselves, what happened by Kriyas Yamsuf and what was its base of Tachlis? By the Kriyas Yamsuf, an interesting thing happened. What we see by Kriyas Yamsuf is that before it happened, Rashi says over there in Bishalach, that Klal Yisrael was Nesunim Bardin. In other words, after they came out of Mitzrayim, they went to the Yam, and suddenly the Bed and Shemala reconvened. The Makatzig was at his old job again. He said to them, wait a minute. Look, I understand, Klal Yisrael Taka now, I saved them, it was saved from Bechor. But one more last time, you see, one more last time, so he said to the Baruch Hashem, are you convinced that Klal Yisrael has the Emunah in your Koyach? He was Makatzig again, and attempted to convince the Baruch Hashem, or the Din, you see, that Klal Yisrael should be tested one more time before the final separation itself. Rashi says that Klal Yisrael was Nesunim Badin, the Nesunim Matzor, meaning that there was a new Hamad Badin. Now, what was the Hamad Badin? And here we see a very interesting concept. What Rashi says was the following, that what the Beit Jamala was deciding was the following. The Beit Jamala wasn't deciding whether or not Klal Yisrael should be Zeicha to a total Yeshua, or they should return back to Mitzrayim. That's not what they were deciding. What Beit Jamala was deciding whether or not the Jews and the Mitzrayim should die in Yam Suf. That was the decision. You see, there was no possibility of Klal Yisrael ever going back to Mitzrayim. That was over. The shaila was if Klal Yisrael could survive the Mitzrayim. Now, from this we see a very interesting thing. We see what Kriyas Yamsuf was, and we see what happened to Mitzrayim. What happened? The main question is the following. After the Jews left Mitzrayim, they came to Yamsuf. Suddenly, Paro got up his koyach with his whole army and ran after Yidden. Now the question you ask, where did Paro get the koyach? Where did he get the koyach to run after the Yidden from? He just lost it all. Marcus Choshech said he has no more koyach, and Marcus Bechoyer says he has no more keser. Where did he get the koyach? Even the Hav needed to run after the Yidden to come back. Yidden were out of that shlita, they were out of that klipa. Mitzrayim was finished. When the Bechor died of Mitzrayim, where did Paro get the koyach to run after the Yidden? The answer is that koyach that Paro had was not the koyach of the klipa, or Kedush B'Zeh HaKlipas. Why? Because he lost it. There was no way Paro and the Mitzrayim were getting it back. Where was that koyach? That koyach was from the Midas Hadin. Why? We all know from the Hanugas HaYichud that in order to bring Yeshua, the Hanugas HaYichud selects an Ummah, in this case Mitzrayim, and he pumps that Ummah with all its Kedusha. And what happens is the people in that Ummah becomes what's called a Loshe V'Tovloi. In other words, these people are Rishoyim, and because of the fact that they're Rishoyim, the Midas Hadin should destroy Rishoyim, V'Alavoyim. Except what the Yichud says is, I'm going to take these Rishoyim and I'm going to give them a tremendous Toiv. What's the Toiv? Oiz and Feres of Kedusha. I'm going to implant tremendous Kedusha in them. I'm going to transfuse tremendous Kedusha in them, and by this Kedusha, they will go up to the highest nations of the world and become the Bechor of the Bria. But that's an Indian of Rosh V'Tovloi. Mitzrayim, from its own standpoint, was a Rishoyim. What does the Midas Hadin say by Rishoyim? They have to be destroyed. So the only thing which can take a Rosh and make them a Toiv is Hanugas HaYichud. Why did Hanugas HaYichud make Mitzrayim the Toiv? Because Hanugas HaYichud chose Mitzrayim, as we said before, to make them an Indian of a native Kilkul Kulam, so that they should be the receptacle and the repository of all the Kedusha of the Bria in the Zoyama, so Klal Yisrael will be able to come and be Matahar it. That's why. Once that job was over, Mitzrayim was no longer needed by the Hanugas HaYichud, which means that as soon as the Hanugas HaYichud withdrew, Mitzrayim became what's called the Rosh V'Raloi, which means that now Mitzrayim was simply under the case, under the Hanugas HaMishpat. Who was the Hanugas HaMishpat? The Sultan himself. And here we see a very, very mystical thing, which I cannot go into here. What happened was, who is the Shaliach of the Hanugas HaYichud? The Sitra Achod, the Sultan himself. He's the Shaliach. You see, because the Kedusha in his hand, there's the Tigbur Sarah. He makes the Rosh V'Tovloi. But when the Rosh V'Tovloi is no longer needed, he becomes a Rosh V'Raloi. But who's the Shliach of Din? The Sitra Achod himself. Which means, incredibly, that the very Metzias of the Sultan did an about face. That up to now, Mitzrayim was the agent of the Sultan. You see, not of the Sultan, but up to now, the Mitzrayim was the agent of Sam HaMovas, the agent of the Hanugas HaYichud, with all the evil and the clip itself, the Hester of the Bria. Suddenly, Mitzrayim now became under the purview, under the jurisdiction of the Hanugas HaMishpat, under the same Sultan. But the Sultan turned his face around. He was no longer the Sultan Mitzar HaYichud, he was the Sultan Mitzar HaMishpat. How is this done? We cannot go into that. The service of this is enormous, because it's involved with the whole mystical concept of the union of what? Of Tigbur Sarah itself. It's the panemius of the Sultan himself, of how he operates according to two different functions. We will not go into this thing. But fundamentally, this is what happened. When the Mitzrayim left, when the Mitzrayim, after Malchus Bechoris, were changed, they were no longer the Ummah that was associated to the Yichud. They were no longer the Ummah of Rosh V'Tovloi. Once they lose the Bechor, they became the Rosh V'Raloi, which means that they were under the Shlita and the domination of the Sultan Mitzar HaMishpat. No, what's the din Mitzar the Mitzrayim? They lost their Chelik Elam Haba. They lost when they said, what? Because they refused to give in to the first two Makkahs. So as we said, when it says Vayichbar Azay Paroi, Mitzrayim was finished. They lost their own Chelik in terms of their own Chelik of Tahara. They were no longer Rosh V'Tovloi. So what must come to them? What must come to them is Ibud. So what happened is the Midas Hadin looked at the Mitzrayim and said, Toivad Nishmosam. All of them must die. You see, But in order to die, there has to be a form of Misa. You see, who's going to give Mitzrayim the koyach of its Misa? The Midas Adin. So the fact that the Mitzrayim were running after the Yidden, they were running after the Yidden to die, not to take the Yidden back. They were running after to die in Yam Suf itself. It was a suicide mission. That's what it was. It was not the koyach of Yichud running after them. It was the koyach of Mishpat on Mitzrayim itself. Except that they were needed in this way. Mitzrayim was needed to die in the water. Midah keneged midah. Since they tried to destroy the Yeladim from Klal Yisrael in the water, their mitzvah would be by water. So they were running to the water. They were running to their own death. It was the mitzvah din that was giving him the koyach. You see, it was the Satan B'tzuas Din that gave him the koyach necessary to commit suicide. That's really what was happening. But at the same time, it was a double slap. Because the Mekatib said, you're right, I'm going to destroy the Egyptians, Mitzvah Din. But who says that the Yidden are Nazarech also? I tell you that the Yidden should also be what? The Yidden should also be destroyed. There's also the meaning of what? Of what do you call it? Of not Tzaddik or Aloi. There's the meaning of Rosh or Aloi. I demand the lives of the Yidden as well, and let them both die together. You see, so the Bonishim says, let there be one more Nesoyim, and that Nesoyim was the death of the Mitzrayim itself. When the Mitzrayim ran after the Yidden, and the Yidden saw it, there was a Nesoyim. Whether or not they would be Ma'am and the Bonishim, they just came out of Mitzrayim. They saw 10 Makkahs. They saw the tremendous loss of Shlita. They should have realized that what? That the defense of the Mitzrayim was not an Indian of Shlita anymore. The very fact that they were saved in the Bechorah showed them that Mitzrayim lost the Shlita. So obviously they should have realized that Mitzrayim was impotent. Anyone who was a Chacham would have understood that Mitzrayim is almost impotent. That what you see is their death march. This is not what? This is not a conquest. They're running to die. But that was the Nesoyim. And Klal Yisrael Taka didn't do well because they started stealing again. So the Mekatib was very, very powerful. They were mamish in the Sunnah Madin, and they were mamish in a Moedik Tzorah. They were in a Moedik Tzorah because they failed to understand the Gili Yuchid that the Bonashim explained to them. They failed to understand that the entire Indian of Mitzrayim was a Rosh of Toivloi, Mitzad Yichud. But now that they lost the Yichud, Mitzrayim is now a Rosh of Amaloi. You see, who is Taka the Indian of the Toiv? Who has the Koyach of the Bria? You have the Koyach of the Bria. What are you afraid of? It's a goitis which is running after you. You see, this was the thing. And with this Nesoyan, unfortunately, they did not do well. You see, so Moshe Taka was in a murder quandary. He didn't know what to do. Moshe did not know if he had the last koyach to open up the sea and destroy the Mitzrayim and take Klal Yisrael through. So when the Bonisham says, go, what are you sitting and davening? You have the schusim already. You know, the schusim is not Klal Yisrael. It's the schus of the ovos. It's kedai. Rashi says over there that the schus of the ovos is enough to take this kitub and see them through the ultimate Yeshua. But unfortunately, Klal Yisrael had to come on to the schus of the ovos itself. This was the last of the schusim, and that's what the Bonishim said to Moshe, that the schus of Avram Yitzchak Yaakov is enough to be put Yeshua over here, even in the case that they failed over here. But what we see is the attempt and the dynamics of what was going on. You see, that Chas v'Sholom, there was a mamash etzad to destroy Klal Yisrael on the last Kituk itself. But it was not, it had no shaykhs to the Mitzrayim. It wasn't the Mitzrayim that would destroy Klal Yisrael. It was the din it was the din on Klal Yisrael itself. And what it was is that the battle in Mitzrayim itself, when the Yidden were in the Shibud Mitzrayim, the Yidden battled the Klippa of the Satan through the of Mitzrayim. Since Mitzrayim was a Rosh of a Toivloi, the relationship of the Jews to Mitzrayim, to the Satan, or to the Indian of the Kitrug, was through the of Mitzrayim. Goy Beker Goy. Once Mitzrayim was lost that Koyach, then at the Kriyas Samsung, the battle was not between Mitzrayim and the Eden. That was their Torah. They thought that it was the battle between them and the Mitzrayim. It wasn't. They should have understood that the Mitzrayim were Goyses them. But what really happened was it was a battle between the Sultan and the Yidden. It was a direct conflict. You see, where the Sultan was not concerned with the Mitzrayim anymore. The Sultan says, I want them for myself. You see, I am not interested in being Meshabbat of anything more through Mitzrayim. I want them for myself. And it was a direct battle between the Yidden and the Koyach of the Makatrig Be'atzmoi himself, not through the Ummah. And that was the battle. It was the schus ovus finally which was matzal Klal Yisrael for such a zach. And only the schus ovus. And that was the thing that Moshe said, Kikashu, Hisyatzu Ruas Yeshuas Hashem. You see, Kikashu Isim Osam HaYoim Loisu Sifin Oid Loisam. No, don't worry. You see, Loisu Sifin Oid Loisam Adonam. There are a number of interpretations here. But basically, in its simplest way, what the Baruch Shem says, you will never see them again. Why? Because they're goysesim. They're goysesim. They have lost the union of tzaddik with tovloi, a rosh with tovloi. They have lost. They are now a rosh of raloi, and it's lost. And now that you will have an emet atzola, because I, the Baruch Shem himself, will be matzal you from the Satan, the kittug of the Satan itself. You see, you will never see them, and you will never see their klipa, and now that you will never see that kittug anymore. Goes not only in Mitzrayim, it goes on the kittug itself. What the Baruch Shem said, because of Avram Yitzchak Yaakov and my haftocha on the bris ben Absalom, you will no longer see this kittug. That's the pneumius also of Lo Yisifin Oid L'Oisam. Lo Yisifin Oid L'Oisam, I feel the kittug itself. Because just as you beat Mitzrayim in the Shibud Mitzrayim in the Yisiyah, you also now are menafseach of the Makatug himself, as he's Makatug to destroy you. And you have vanquished both enemies, the Shliach and the Mishaleach. The Mitzrayim who is the Shlichim, and the Mishaleach who is the Satan himself. And you will never see, and you will come out into Madrega. And then when they came out of the Yam, Ozdir Shir Moshe, then Moshe sang the Shir. Why? Because that was the total Gula. There was an emes of Tahara. It was a Tahara not only from the Ummah, from the Shaliach, it was the Tahara, but it was a Tahara from the Makatug himself. It was an ultimate Tahara from the total Zoyamah. Klal Yisrael at that point was now ready for the Yemoisa Mashiach itself. It simply made now a simple matter for them to go on now to the Torah, to Merkabel, the Torah B'tzuz HaKetza, into the ultimate Yeshua itself. History says itself that the Mitzrayim finally were finished. Why? Because after Yetzias Mitzrayim, which occurred about 1240 approximately BCE, before the Common Era, historically, Egypt as a nation never again reached its height, and the descent of Egypt as an Ummah went down. Ramses the Great, or the second Ramses I believe, was the last of the great pharaohs. After him, Egypt went through its decline, until finally it began to be conquered by all the nations, Assyria, Babylonia, and Greece, and Persia, and all the nations began to conquer Egypt, until finally it just simply dissipated at the time of the Romans, and so on. But the interesting thing is that we could see that Mitzrayim was emptied of its oisens first, that it was a topic of Rosh Hashanah, so that the entire empire, which lasted thousands of years, Mitzrayim started with its koyachs in 3100 BCE with the time of Minis, you see, Anama, who united Upper Lower Egypt, and that's when the koyach of Egypt started. So it took Mitzrayim 2,000 years. For 2,000 years when Mitzrayim was in its heyday, except for a small period of time when the Hyksos dominated. But fundamentally it was in its heyday. From then on it went down, and it never again was the great Egyptian kingdom that it was before that time. This basically represents the understanding of what were the spiritual processes which happened in Yetzias Mitzrayim and Kriyas Samshev itself, and the entire also Shibud Mitzrayim itself. What I'd just like to briefly go into is Chag Pesach itself, and some of the Ikar things mitzvahs that we keep on Chag Pesach. We all know from before, because we've mentioned before in the Shir by Rosh Hashanah, that fundamentally what the Ramchal says openly is that every Yom Tov itself is a replication of the Shefa which once existed earlier in that period of time. Pesach itself is Manche Roseinu. So what the Baruch Shem said was basically the following. Even though you were not Zoicha to a Geula from what? From the Shibud Mitzrayim, because of the Chet of the Egel. Because of the Chet of the Egel, Klal Yisrael was not Zoicha to fulfill the ultimate what? Redemption at that time. So the Geula Rishonah had to await for Geula Shniya. But what the Baruch Shem said is, I will repeat that Shefa of Geula every year. You see. And it will come down, the Hashpor which existed then, which was the Shefa that allowed these koichas, which allow these processes of redemption, of Geula, to transpire, will come down to the Bria once a year, Yutar Nisan. Which means that Chag Pesach duplicates the Shefa, which once appeared a long time ago, in the original Yetzias Mitzrayim itself. What's the purpose of this? so that the Yidden can be mahana from the Shefa and slowly bring the second Gula. That's the thing. It's a bridge. Chag HaPesach is the bridge between the first Gula and the ultimate Gula. Because it's the time of the year when the Shefa of the first Gula is again duplicated and is brought down to the Bria, and where Yidden are able to be toifus that Shefa and slowly be masakin a Zoyama and be matahir this Zoyama, so that Klal Yisrael could slowly go on to the next Gula. This is the fundamental idea of Chag HaPesach. The Ika mitzvah of Chag HaPesach is what? Is Chometz U'Matzah. And fundamentally what the Bonishim says is the following, that if you want to be Zeicha to the Shefa, if you want to be Zeicha to the Shefa Gula, to an extra level of Tahara, to assist year by year, to establish a Tahara so that you'll be Zeicha to another Gula, you have to do certain things. There are certain conduits that you have to do. And what the Bonishim says is there are two mitzvahs per Ika that you have to do. You have to do the Ika, the mitzvah of Shmiras Chometz, by Yurov, by Yomatzah. You cannot have Chometz in your house, and you have the Inyan of Achilas Matzah as well. And I'd like to understand what is Matzah and what is Chometz. What does this have to do with the Gula Rishona? The truth of the matter is, the entire Pesach and the Pnimius of the entire Inyan of Tahara of the Bria and the whole Inyan of Yosef is wrapped up in the concept of Chometz U'Matzah. How is that? What exactly is Chometz? Chometz fundamentally is dough. Dough which is applied to a certain sa'or or leaven, and the dough ferments. And as it ferments, what happens is carbon dioxide gas expands in it and the dough rises. The risen dough is essentially composed of the substance dough itself and the gas which expands it. Chazal calls sa'or, leaven, the satan. And what Chazal say is that Klal Yisrael want to do the mitzvahs, but what can they do? Ela hasor shebe'isa. When Chazal talk about the Yitzhara, they refer to the name sa'or or leaven, you see. Which shows us that Chometz is an Inyan of the satan. How is it an Inyan of the satan? Because basically, Chometz is an alvuvia. It's an alvuvia of substance, of mamoshes, and gas. You see, in a davar sheyesh bo mamish and a kind of davar she'ein bo mamish. It's this type of alvuvia. This alvuvia is symbolic or represents the alvuvia of the Bria. Because ever since the Chet of Adam Rishon, the alvuvia of the Bria has dictated that what? That the Bria is composed of Kedushin Tumah, Zeh b'soich Zeh. That's the Inyan of alvuvia. The Inyan of Pesach was to be matar this alvuvia. Chometz, in terms of its actual substance, represents the Bria in alvuvia. And what basically is that Klal Yisrael and all the entire world, we eat bread, we eat Chometz. Why? Because just like the world is in a state of alvuvia, where world is in a state of Kedusha B'Zech HaTumah, we eat an achila, which represents an alvuvia. Which is what? Which is the dough, the substance, plus the gas, the fermentation in that sense. So Chometz symbolizes the status of the Bria in its Mokum alvuvia. That's essentially what Chometz is. But the Buddhism said on Pesach, you're not supposed to eat Chometz. Why? Because in the first Geula, Klal Yisrael was Zeicha to an Emes Tahara. There was no more Zoyam on the Bria. There was no more Alvuvia. If there's no more Alvuvia, then you don't have to eat an Achila of an Alvuvia, which is Chometz. Adrabah, you must stay away from it. You're now Zeicha to an Inyan of Matzah. Because what is Matzah? Matzah is the dough which has not risen at all. Matzah is a what? Is an Achila without Alvuvias. You see, it's a pure substance itself. It's just a dough without any kind of fermentation at all. So what Pesach symbolizes is the following. Just like the entire Shibud of Mitzrayim and the whole Gul of Mitzrayim represents the notion of the Bria going from a state of what? Of Tumah to a state of Tahara, where there's the Tahara of the Alvuvia of the Bria, of the Zorma of the Klip of the Bria. So the Bria became Zoicha to a new state of Achila. The Bria went from the Achila of Adam Rishon after the Chet, which is a Matzah, which is an Inyan of what? A Matzah or an Inyan of Chometz, to an Inyan of Adam Rishon before the Chet, which is an Inyan of Matzah. In its own symbolic way, Matzah was the Achila of Adam Rishon before the Chet, when there was no Alvuvia. Chometz is the Achila of the Bria after the Chet, when there is an Alvuvia. So what the Bonishim said is, the whole purpose of Shibud Mitzrayim was to be Neitel Tzchak Kulam, to be Metal the Zerm of all the entire Olam Haba, you see, so that you can then be Zeicha to Olam Haba. So therefore, fundamentally, once it was finished, the Buddhism said, you now must eat what? You could eat matzah. You see, there's a mitzvah to eat matzah. Before the Bria was in a state of Tahara, there's no mitzvah to eat matzah. Why? Because the Achila did not reflect the status of the Bria. If the Bria is in a state of Avovia, you see, then there's no Indian of eating matzah. Adarabah, Chometz is what's shaykh to that state. But after the Indian of Mitzrayim, after the Shibud Negul of Mitzrayim, the Bria was now in a state of what? Of Tahara, where the Eden now could be Zerchat to the Mashiach. So the Baruch Shem said, I'll Matzava you now to eat matzah. Because by eating matzah, you see, you now eat the Achila, which is appropriate for the status of the door at that time. And you must stay away from Chometz, you see. Why? Because Chometz is no longer appropriate for you. It doesn't mean that the Baruch Shem asked Chometz entirely. But basically, by distinguishing between Chometz and Matzah, the Baruch Shem distinguished between the status of the Bria itself. If the Bria is in the state of a Mateh, it's in the state of what? Of Matzah. If it's in the state of a Nochosh, with an Avovia, it's in the state of Chometz. And Chayesor with the Shibud of Mitzrayim went from a Bria in the state of a what? Chometz, to a Bria in the state of Matzah. And this is the Indian of Pesach. What the Baruch Shem says is, if you want to be Zercha to the Shefa of that original Gula, even though you failed, I will allow the Shefa of the Gula to come down, but it's a very special Shefa, because it's a unique Shefa which is different than all the other Mo'adim. The Shefa of Pesach is the kind of Shefa which brings an extra measure of Tar, of Zoyama, which is Metalkal the Bria. It's Metal the Zoyama, which is directly responsible for Golas, more than any other Shefa that comes down for any of the Yom Tov. The Shefa of Pesach is the Shefa which Metal the Zoyama of Golas itself. You see? And the Baruch Shem says, you no longer was Zerchat to that because of the original Gula. But I will allow the Shefa to come down again so that if you use that Shefa, you will be Metal that same Zoyama in a slow way to be Zerchat to the Gula Asida. You see? But how can you be Metal? By what? By establish yourself in the state of Achila with respect to these two different levels of the world. If you're noyev to eat matzah, in other words, if you eat matzah and you establish your achila, you see, with an achila which has no shaykh to Avovia, then the chef of Tahara will come down to you. If you eat chometz, however, and if you establish yourself in a state of achila which is shaykh to the world of Avovia, you will block and you will impede that chef from coming down, because that chef is the chef of Tahara. That chef only has shaykh to matzah, because that chef brings the world to a madreg of matzah. By eating chometz, you block or retard, obstruct the ability of that chef to come down. So by the shmira of chometz and matzah, what fundamentally you do, you access the shefa of what? Of a tahara, which is matar the zoyma, which is most responsible for the golus itself. If we look at the Agoda, however, gives us a different reason for matzah. That the Yidden did not have time. The Baruch Shem told them by Chatzois, after Makat V'choros, go out. So there was no more time to make matzah. They couldn't ferment their dough. And because of that, the Yidden had to go out with matzah. So, what's that reason? But the truth of the matter is, this is Megala, the Gavaldik Chesed of Baruch Shem and the Haftoch of the Ovis. Why? Because of the following reason. If the Yidden had been Zoicha to the Golas Mitzrayim, to the Gul of Mitzrayim, Mitoich Schusim, if they didn't need the Shibud, if they didn't need the Korban Pesach, you see, they would have went out of Mitzrayim on their schedule. Then the Yidden would have told the Baruch Shem, we leave now, on our schedule. But what happened was that the Gula did not happen that way. The Gula happened what? Mitzrayim HaYichud, not Mitzrayim HaMishpah, where the Yidden had to be Zoicha because of the Korban Pesach and the Zoicha the Shibud Mitzrayim. So what the Baruch Shem said is, you must leave according to my schedule. And my schedule says you leave by Chatzos. So Matzah symbolizes the concept how the Gula happened. That the Gula did not happen according to the schedule of the Yidden, because they were not in control of the Gula process. Rather it happened according to the schedule of the Baruch Shem, because the Gula happened according to the Hanodas HaYichud. And that's the Haftocha that the Baruch Shem said to Avram. When Avram said, B'mo Eda, how do I know that the Yidden will be Zechah the Gula? The Baruch Shem said, they will be Zechah the Gula, one way or another. And I promise you, that if I have to, they'll be Zechah the Gula according to my schedule. Maybe goylev nevneim leman shemoy bi'avo lemani lemaz niyaseh. And this seed is contained in the whole in of matzah itself, because matzah, the fact that the Yidden did not have enough time to bake the bread, shows us that the entire gula ran according to the anhaga and the schedule and the timing of the hanodas hayichud. And this was the ultimate haftacha that the Baruch Shem gave to the others. You see that matzah symbolizes b'mo'edah, when the Baruch Shem says, I guarantee it. Either their schedule or my schedule. Matzah symbolizes this actual zach.